So the first thing that you want to do when you're answering the K is you need to have a specific order, okay? There's nothing worse than when it's time for your roadmap and you go like this. Alt, framework, links, no. Links, impact, no. This, that. Like, you need to have like a specific game plan to do this. And one of the things that helps me, as I think about it from like watching rounds, is that the big part about the critique is it only works if they have a framework that allows for the arguments to be leveraged. So the first thing you always that I would suggest doing is talk about framework. Now, on framework, we have a couple of specific things that we like to talk about. The first thing that we do is we run some stuff talking about how policy theory is good. You can do this in two ways. Who here has at the top of the case they say something like definitions are contextual, policy around net benefits, and just leave it something like that. Do a lot of people do that? Okay. There's two ways you can break this down. Like, we like to put some preempts in there, right? And preempts are basically a preemptive strike against the case. So like, if I know I'm hitting Gaffney, I know like there's a 99.75% chance that she's going to be running some sort of critique against me. So we will put some preempts in there. So when you say, top of case definitions are contextual, you also want to put stuff down like we're going for policy. You say things like policymaking is good, right? And we say policymaking is good and role playing is good. So we'll say, something to the fact that, like, as policymakers, you should endorse progressive political reforms, and policymaking is key to agency. Policymaking is most real world. Like, you don't see people in the Senate being like, yo, dog, like, I think we should talk about the hyperreal today to solve the world's problems, or like, yo, I think that today is a good day that we should talk about, Marxism to figure out how to solve for, what was the last round resolution?
GMOs?
Yeah. Let's solve GMOs. Cool. Like, that sounds great. Instead of finding like political reasons why we should solve for GMOs, we should just sit there and talk about why Marxism is better than capitalism today on the Hill. Like, it just does not happen. So you want to say why it's like real world. Yeah.
Why is policymaking key to agency?
Because you have to have choices, right? So like agency is key. It's key for you to have like to be able to make choices, and also for you to be able to see how policies are enacted, so you can figure out how you can make real change, right? So you want to talk about how like agency is key because it's a praxis for you to make like real change. Okay. Then in your framework, the last thing I put up in the top case, I'll put something in there that says something like any critical links that aren't topic specific or affirmative link specific are links of omission and should not be evaluated in the round.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So any links that aren't like resolution or that aren't like case specific, or any links to the critique that aren't based off of like links to our plan specific, are links of omission. And what that means is they'll say something like, my ideology is bad, or my methodology is bad, or the resolution is bad, and that's a way to preempt that by saying like, look, dude, like, you're trying to link me into your critique for stuff I never said, and there's a lot of bad reasons like for that, right? And so it's just a preemptive strike. Now, after they run the critique, there's a couple things you want. At the top, you want to answer the framework. So in the framework, there's a couple things they'll probably say. Like, the first, they'll either go for, like, you should look at discursive impacts. We should look at, like, the representations of the affirmative. Like, so let's say you should look at representations. Basically, you have to think about it on the critique. The reason why they run framework is so that they can weigh the impacts of the critique and to exclude the impacts of the affirmative. Remember how, for those who in my last lecture, you think of like framework sort of like as a criteria. It's like a lens in which the judge can look at the round. And the negative wants to make a big circle that only looks at like the negative case, right? And the government wants one that looks at the government case, right? So what you want to do is when the negative says, our framework means you should look at representations before you get to like fiat or plan or game silliness, because they'll say stuff like, there is no, fiat is illusionary, right? Does anyone know what that means?
It doesn't happen.
Yeah, unfortunately, everyone who won the Gov case last round, we're not putting stickers on genetically modified foods today, right? And that's their answer. So what you want to do is you directly answer that back saying well, maybe fiat is illusory, but we can role play. And you want to say role playing is good. Role playing is good for a couple reasons. The first is that simulation of different roles through fiat encourages learning and empowerment.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Simulation of different roles through fiat encourages learning and empowerment. The first is that you get to see how, you could say things like this United States federal government, we can see how, state structures operate. And when we learn how they operate, that's the best way for us to figure out how to create real or durable change. The second part is it empowers the debater. Also, you can say role-playing creates a gigantic focus that creates real change. And we always bring up the yes men. Has anyone watched the BBC? Come on, someone watched the BBC, right?
Is it the one that they always say yes to everything? Or no? That's
Kind of. No, that's the movie. That's the movie. No, but the yes men are they're basically they're sort of like the Colbert Report kind of, where they find governmental issues and they make fun of it. So what they did is that Dow Chemical put mass amounts of poisonous toxic gas in India through these bad poisonous plants, big huge factories, and it was killing people, led to deformations. It was really horrible, nasty shit.
Talking about Bhopal?
Yes, talking about Bhopal. So what the Yes Men did is they, on their show, role-played and pretended to be Dow Chemicals, which is the corporation that owned these factories, and they apologized for what they did. They shut down the factory on the show, and they pretended what it looked like as if this gigantic, nasty corporation was being nice and tried to make reparations. And because of that, Dow Chemicals shut down the plant and did pay reparations. So you say that's your warrant, right? So you can say, when we role play, real things could happen in the future. Okay. A second event, the other one we do is we put an impact. Our impact is always war games. The United States and other nations participate in war games or computer simulated role games, and and you find specific ones. So we would pick the one with Iran. We have war game. The Millennial Challenge was a war games with Iran, and Iran basically jacked us big time. So what we do, as you can tell, we have not gone to war with Iran yet. So you can say, look, this role-playing stopped, basically, you can say a nuclear war or shut down of the economy because of the oil pathways through, is it the Suez Canal right there? I always forget my geography. Suez Canal, I believe. Mm-hmm. The Suez Canal, it stopped us from going to massive war. It stopped our Fifth Fleet from getting jacked. So you want to have some sort of impact to role-playing. Now, people sometimes, I feel, make the mistake in saying that there's you should vote on framework. And there are some judges that will allow for this. But I think conceptually, when we think of framework, we need to look at it as how do we evaluate this round, right? So that's when you want to make those distinctions. Yeah. And then in the PMR, for whoever's PMR is in here, you want to use these framework arguments to tell the judge sort of as a roadmap or a lens to view the round holistically. The other thing you want to put in your framework that's really important is that because fiat is illusory, even us just talking about the impacts is good, right? So you can say, look, while fiat's illusionary, we're talking about, genetically modified organisms and why they are bad, so we can do things like make sure people don't get really like weird forms of food that's bad for them, or get like really drug-resistant strains of bacteria. Like these discursive impacts and talking about them are also good. You can also talk about how the alt as well can't solve, and so you can talk about how you should be able to weigh the impacts of your PMC versus the impacts on the critique, right? You don't want to give up on your PMC. If you give up on your PMC, you're doing it wrong because you basically just lost your 7-minute PMC speech, right? So you want to have answers to why in your PMC you should be able to leverage those impacts against the critique. You can also talk about how, sorry, I'm going to go back to role-playing real quick. The last part is you can say that you can turn the critique to role-playing because role-playing solves political apathy and reinvigorates personal politics. And you can say how by accepting citizens of political inert identities, it guarantees inequality and exploitation. So the only way to fix that would be by constructing identities as public actors, and this allows for emancipatory and critical pedagogies to thrive. So basically what that means is that by not allowing for role-playing, you silence individuals. When you role-play, it's the only way we can see how political actors can then shed light on inequalities or shed light on, racist or other types of problems. The next thing you want to do is you want to talk about the criteria, right? We say net benefits a lot, but what net benefits really is consequentialism and or kind of utilitarianism, which is kind of one pretty similar. So you want to say things why either utilitarianism is good, or you want to say why consequentialism is good, right? Because they're going to say something. That's the problem. Critiques are always so different, but there's always some sort of new way to weigh them. So you need to make answers on why your specific criteria is beneficial. So we'd always have consequentialism good in ours, because policy, and one of the things you want to talk about is how policy makers must take into account what's best for society, and they always look at the consequences of their actions. You can say stuff like consequentialism is good because even the critique has to use some sort of consequentialist framework for them to identify or weigh out their impacts, right? So you can even say consequentialism is used within the critique. Therefore, we should be able to weigh our impacts through that criteria on case. Yeah.
I guess when you break down not only the answers to the critique framework, but the critique framework itself, what are some of the core differences, and how would you, I guess, point out those differences, and I guess point to those differences?
What's that one more time?
Okay, when we break down not only the answers to the critique framework, but the critique framework itself, how do you compare those two frameworks and show the judge there's everything?
Well, in the MG, you want to make your answers, right? Like your comparisons are ones that are going to come more in the PMR or at the very, very bottom of your MG, right? Because the MG, that's more like of a speaker role thing, right? Your job in the MG is to just methodically cover. Like you want to answer things, you want to put answers on everything, and you just cover everything, right? As much as you can. So what you're talking about is the weighing mechanism, and that's going to happen more in the PMR, and that is when you want to find, it's hard to explain, but you want to find, dropped arguments at the other teammates. So if they drop the fact that you can leverage the impacts of your case versus the critique, then you're going to say, look, judge, simple win for Pepperdine today, or where are you from?
UC El Paso.
Simple way for El Paso to win today because they dropped that we get to leverage the impacts of case versus impacts of the critique. We solve for nuclear war or Holocaust, which means that we have an extinction level impact to their Marxist thing where we get to re-envision a world in Marxism, which somehow stops the bougies, right? And that's kind of what you do. You kind of trivialize what they say a little bit, and that's how you kind of weigh those arguments. You know what I mean? Or you weigh out the frameworks. they have this framework on, you know, like personal identity politics, but we're showing that policymaking is better because we show that when it comes to personal identity politics, our ability to envision ourselves within our own state system and how to break that down is better for society, and it's better for personal identity politics. So we have the better framework and we have the better ways in which to solve for these problems, right? So just compared to, I mean, I would also use the word because a lot. I think everyone in here should add the word because into their repertoire in debate. Yeah. Because you wanna say stuff like this. Their framework says something that like fiat is illusory. Our framework says that yes, fiat is illusory, but role playing is best for political empowerment. Our argument is the best because role playing does these impacts, right? So the reason why you impact your framework is there's got to be a reason to prefer your framework, right? If they just say fiat's illusory, you say role playing is good. How does a judge distinguish those two claims? And that comes down to the impacts, right? So you want to have impacts and warrants. Warrant comparison's another thing that helps in that situation as well. Look, like we give you the Bhopal disaster. We give you the Millennium Challenge for war games. Like these are specific areas in which role playing has made real world differences. They're talking about Marxism. Like I have not heard of a new French Revolution. Like I've not heard of anyone talking about let's destroy capitalism in America as a feasible alternative. So like I think we're winning the real world battle here, right? Okay. After framework, you want to. I like going to alternative next. I guess. Actually, let's just go down the critique in order. We'll get into orders later. So next, let's go to, usually it's going to be links. You have the same type of things you can do. You got link terms, right? And you got no links. These are the ones that are tough. Like, links are tough just because if they're, let me make this very, very clear. If they are good critique debaters, which is a big difference. If they're good critique debaters, their links are solid. I mean, that's why you run critiques. You run critiques because you are going to research and find very hyper-specific links to the K, right? So your best option is to just put some line by line on it so you have some coverage. You want to say either how your case does not link or how your case is uniquely different than the original idea of whatever they're critiquing. So it's capitalism. It's like, look, we don't link because we're not talking about like the normal, in the last round we said we're not the normal idea of capitalism. We are labeling genetically modified foods in order to, it'll hurt the economy in order for safety. So that could be like a link term or a no link. And you just want to do a couple there. You just want to make it so they have to talk about it, right? You want to put some things there. Like link terms, unless it's a really bad generic critique that from a really bad team, you're not going to win the link. This is not a way to win the round. Okay, this is a way to make answers, a way to mitigate the links, and the way you use it in the debate round and the PMR then is link distinction. This is where you want to say, look, like with these no links, with this link term, we feel that at least with our perm, we have mitigated or resolved most of the links to the criticism, which gives you the reason to vote on the net benefits to the perm. Does that make sense? How you kind of use them later in the speech, but they're not game winners in of themselves. Cool? All right. Impacts. Impacts are a lot like links. There's going to be different types of impacts. There can be discursive impacts, so that's where like the rhetoric or what is being said in the round would lead to certain things. There can be impacts to the way in which you envision the world. So if you envision a capitalist society, then the impact would be something like you take away all meaning to life because you make people into money-making objects. So this is where you want to listen for keywords. There'll be stuff like, you hear things like root cause, Anything that's root cause, you must answer. If they have any inevitability claims, you must answer. And people hide these. These are all hidden by different critique debaters when they're good, and they hide them everywhere. They hide them in framework, they hide them in the links, they'll hide them in the impacts, they'll hide them sometimes in the alt solvency. But dude, if you ever hear a root cause, flow the crap out of that thing and circle it gigantic and put little stars or smiley faces or whatever you do on your flow to remember things, you must answer it. So if you do not answer root cause arguments, that's like giving up complete uniqueness, which means that no matter what you argue, you are still the root cause of every single problem. Do you understand the root cause? This is very clear. Yeah? Cool. Also on impacts, you either want to mitigate the impacts, so you want to say like, look man, like, yeah, capitalism has some bad things, but look, it also does some good things. You can have some alternative causality arguments, like, yeah, those are bad, but that's not the capitalist society we're talking about. That's like some crazy, capitalist society that Adam Smith talked about in the Free Hand of Capitalism back in the early 1920s. Like, we're not that form of capitalism, right? So you make those distinctions. Once again, impact turning and critique barely happens. I mean, as a way to win the entire round. Why are you shaking your head at me?
Well, I feel like impact turning decay is one of the most common responses to it.
It is a very common response, but like,
I think it can easily win rounds.
Yeah, I mean you can. That's true, but yeah, I guess.
Like when people don't want to get boggled down in all this, you just impact turn it.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you're getting kind of lost in the critique debate, just argue the impacts, and you can win on impact turns. Yeah.
Can you give an example of an impact turn?
Yeah. So we'll say it's a capitalism K. So there's capitalism, and they say capitalism is bad. They say capitalism is the root cause of all violence. Because it conceptualizes people into dollar signs. And that's uniquely dehumanizing. So an impact turn to that would be, no, turn capitalism allows for people to make choices in order to make money, and when they make money, then they can do things like get an education, they can learn how to like dance, they can learn how to do other things, which allows for people to self-actualize. If you look at a world before capitalism, like the Dark Ages, the way that the states would treat their people, they would kill people in order to have control. That's why they used to hang people from the gallows in the middle of the square, is they'd be like, look homie, if you don't obey the rules, you're going to be this dude strung up on this pole right here. Now in capitalism, they realize that human beings have utility and that they can work. That means they don't kill them anymore, they allow them to work, and through that work, we've been able to get people things like more rights. Also, you need to be educated to have better jobs, which means we get education. Also, it's better for the environment. We're able to come up with new and better ways to fix the environment. I'll get you a second, I promise. And the last one you can say, like my one I like, is that capitalism saves the environment because we now have 7 billion people, right? We cannot revert to a bartering system. There's just too many humans on the planet, which means that like if you get rid of capitalism, like you'll lead to a massive genocide based off of starvation and or resources. Like when was the last time we had a potato famine? Like a while, right? Yeah.
I'm just going to say, you didn't characterize it like this, but it's often just called cap good and come up with all the reasons, like you were saying, like the benefits of.
Yeah, so I was going to get to solvency on that, but yeah. I usually put that under solvency. I usually put that under solvency.
Why?
Because they will give an alternative and say, well, their alternative solves, and those are almost like links to their impact. It's almost like their links, right, to solve the impacts. And so I'll put a big block there, and I'll show like the alternative isn't durable enough to solve the problem, and can also like turn it as well. So.
Do you only do that if their solvency is like particular to solving their impacts and not just like the individual rejection?
Yes.
Oh, wait.
I don't understand what the difference would be if you put all the reasons why capitalism is good in your solvency or if it's in your impact turn.
It depends if their criticism is just like an all-out reject, or I guess it's because sometimes the alternative is a counterplan. That's what I meant. Sorry. The alternative is a counterplan. Then I'll put it on solvency.
Oh.
That's what I meant. Sorry. Thanks for that. Yeah.
Where would you put like a cap inevitable argument, or like would you put those?
Like in the same place or like on the impacts. Also, other impact terms you can go for too is like what does the Reformation look like? I mean, or on the alternative, what does the Reformation look like after their plan has been, after their critique is enacted, right? Yeah.
I guess following her question, would you put that on the impact level or more on the alt solvency? Because if you I guess if you make a cap like brainwaves kind of a thing, consumerist mindset, would you put that on the alt solvency?
Sometimes you put it on the framework, depending if that's where they argue it. It's usually where they argue it. Like sometimes, like in the framework, they'll say stuff like on a thesis page that capitalism does these bad things. Or they'll wait and they'll put it somewhere in the impacts. I mean, it really is like where do the other team put it? You might want to put it there for clash, right? Or you can strategically put it somewhere else and then cross-apply it and then have that cross-application for the PMR.
Okay. All right.
So, I mean, it's just one of those things that you just kind of get familiar with different critiques and kind of feel them out, and it takes a little bit of time because there are many places you can put them. All right, next, the alternative, which is probably the most important page. Okay, on the alternative, there are a couple things you should do. What should you always do for an alternative? How about when they read the critique? When they read the alternative, what should you do?
Ask for a copy.
Alt text.
Yes, you should always ask for a copy. Why do you want a copy?
So they don't change it.
Yes, so they don't change it. What else? Perm texts are good. Perm texts are really good. If you're saying perm do both, you are doing it very wrong. Okay? You want to have a text. You want to say like.
Unless you're in front of college.
Yeah, except for very, very, very few people who still believe both is legitimate. And even for those people, I do it anyways because sometimes they're in a weird mood. So you want to say stuff like, perm, we're going to do the plan, which is to label all genetically modified organisms, and we're going to embrace, you know, whatever the alternative. So it could be like the conceptualization of Marxism, the stuff like that. Yeah.
Why does there need to be a perm text? Why can't you just say do both?
Like, what part of both are you doing? Like, if because their alternative is usually reject you, or don't vote for the affirmative, or perm, vote negative, in the face of capitalist pig dogs. Like, right? So if you say perm, do both, like, the other team can just be like, sweet, do both. Like, that means you vote neg, because vote neg is in our alternative. You guys are dummies. Thank you for that. Right? That's why you want, like, a specific text.
Okay.
Also, you want to run multiple perms, right? And if you have perm do both, how do I know if that's different than perm do the plan in all non-competitive parts of the alternative? How, as a judge, do I know that distinction?
How many perms is too many?
I mean, if you watch MPT from 2 years ago, Lauren Kanoth and Josh Ramsey beat Adam Testman, which is probably one of the brightest debate minds I've ever seen in my entire life, because they overwhelmed him with perms. They gave like 7 or 8 perms. I'll go through some of my favorites. My first is perm, do both. And that's where you actually say what the plan is and that have a text, right? Then you want to justify those reasons. Think of perms almost as another procedural or theory in which you want to have standards to your perms, solvency to your perms, or think of it as advantage, sorry. So you want to have like reasons to prefer it and impacts to it, right? So we run stuff like polyphonic discourse. All that means is when you have multiple perspectives, it's the best way to create new practices of ideology. It also reconciles the common truths between both sides. The second part we always say is a Trojan horse. Who here knows what a Trojan horse is? What's a Trojan horse?
Oh, well, I was going with the history context, but not.
Yeah, we're going for the history context.
Okay.
Very nice.
oh, we can see
The Trojans, yeah, exactly. The Trojans
Yeah.
were trying to destroy this group, right? And the Spartans, and they decide to jump up on this horse, and they go up inside, right? And they think it's a present. They go inside past the gate, and at night, they kill everybody, right? The perm is the same thing. What we are is we are embracing Marxism, but we are getting inside the capitalist system and exploding it from the inside, right? Do you understand how that works?
Skywalker and the Death Star.
Yeah, dog, that's what I'm saying.
Just master tool.
I mean, yeah. Yeah.
Would those kinds of perms be legit? Would they be legitimate for the affirmative to do? I mean, aren't they?
That's not a perm, that's like a reason to why you should do the perm. It's a reason to prefer, this is perm do both.
Okay, do both. But, okay, I'm sorry.
Why else make them
Uprising-
deal with it at least? Spend some time on it.
I'm a little confused about that because I didn't think that the affirmative could do things that were, I guess, outside of the realm of, I guess, normal affirmative ground.
Well, it's still a normal affirmative ground, right? A perm isn't, a perm is just saying that there's no reason why they're not mutually exclusive.
Test the competition.
Exactly, test the competition. So we're saying, my perm is not adding new stuff to it. Sorry. Try not to cuss, I promise. Stuff. It's not we're adding new stuff to it or new planks to it. We're just saying that we can do all of my plan, and I can do most of the critique. Does that make sense?
But what if? Okay, I'm sorry. But what if most of the, I guess, non-competitive parts of their critique involves having to use their framework? And
Well, I mean, we're already assuming that we've argued framework, which allows us to leverage our affirmative.
Yeah.
Okay? Does that make sense? Like, you just need to make those framework arguments that we talked about before, and then that grants you opening into the round to argue those, right? Or you can just say, we're allowed to now merge ideologies or merge what we decide to do in the plan and merge the ideas of the critique together through the perm, which means that we can look at both frameworks. Yeah.
So the idea of the perm to prove that like there's a unique net benefit of doing the perm over just the alt.
And also to shield the links to the critique.
So like you have to prove that like the part that you're not including from the alternative doesn't solve as much as the perm does.
I mean, kind of. Not too much. I mean, usually the only part that you're trying not to solve is vote negative.
Yeah.
Which, you know, good K teams will have reasons, very specific reasons why you have to vote negative, and you must answer those, right? But that's why we talk about policy making good, and you leverage those arguments across. The next one is seeding the political. The next reason to prefer the perm do both is seeding the political, and all this is that you're talking about how the critique does not engage in the political realm, and that just allows for the right or the state to take over. And we hide a solvency turn in here. We say that this turns the solvency of the critique, because when you cede the political, you allow for the state to enact worse policies, which leads to totalitarianism and genocide.
Can you repeat that last part? The solvency term?
Yeah, you see, it turns the solvency because the right or the state of the will then will be able to like take over your movement, and it'll create worse policies. So you can say it creates like totalitarianism, it creates and genocide. Last thing you'll put down is shields the link to the K.
What shields the link?
The perm. The perm shields the link to the critique, yeah.
Question about that. So other argument that was like very similar to that is that I've heard, maybe you can help finish up on it, but it's like you can't live in a critique only world because you have to always there has to be an action taken. I don't know.
I mean that's more. I think I would use that in more of like the Trojan horse to see the political.
Okay.
Opposed to shields and link. I mean, shields and link is very specific to saying that look, if we perm this, then the links to the links of the critique to my plan go away, and it's also a solvency takeout because you'd be like, look, like if the K is durable, then the perm should shield the links to the critique. If not, then the critique itself is not durable and a reason why you should not vote for it. It's sort of like a double bind, it's not the best answer, but something in there that will definitely like F with the other team a little bit, and if you drop it, you can win with it. The next perm is perm, do the alt and the plan. Or sorry, do the perm, do the alternative, do the plan and the alternative in all other instances. The next one is perm. I like this one, it's really funny. Perm, do the alternative and give us the ballot.
Is that physically or metaphorically?
I mean, metaphorically, as in give us the ballot by circling affirmative. And that's where you say, like, if you're a true activist and you don't give a shit about the ballot, you just want to get your word out, and you did, so vote for us. And the second part is to say there's no reason the neg is key. There's no reason why you have to vote negative to solve for the critique. The next one is perm, vote affirmative, and discuss the critique after the round. You can have like a little thing, a reason to prefer would be real world solvency. It solves the best because we can actually discuss the critique outside of a competitive atmosphere, which means we can learn about it more, we can understand it more, we can, figure it out more.
You can also do it on an objective basis because we're not trying to win the round.
Yeah, exactly. Then there's like some funny ones that I like. Like one would be the ghost perm. The ghost perm is fun. Some judges will just laugh, which is good, but also the ghost perm is cool. Say the ghost perm, like vote affirmative this one time as a massive act in hypocrisy, and this moment of hypocrisy will haunt you in your dreams, and will lead to you having to do something in the real world to like make up for it that is good. There's like the graffiti perm. The graffiti perm is like circle a ballot half and then draw all over the ballot saying that, capitalism is bad or Marxism is good or I love feminists, something like that. The next is you want to have some theory. So you want to have some sort of theory on the alternative. So that would be stuff like alternative vagueness.
Would that be a new sheet? Would that be on the alt page?
That's like very dependent on your judge, right? Some judges, if you say new sheet in the MG, they will want to strangle you. So for those, I would say no. Others don't matter. Haven't you had that before?
Very rarely.
Dude.
That's just the Northwest thing.
Yeah, see, in the Northwest, they don't care. In Southern California, they're like, why are you making this debate harder for me? So a lot of times...
MG theory runs all the time up here.
Yeah, but they're saying as a new sheet.
Yeah.
Really?
Oh yeah, like multiple conditional off, bad, like, shit like that.
Yeah, so you can either do one or the other.
Switch settings.
Yeah. You have something?
Or not switch it, policy making.
Is your hand up?
No.
No, it's just chilling. Okay. So you have alt vagueness, which is just like regular vagueness, right? So interpretation, like the alternative, must like show how it gets solvency. B subpoints violation. The alternative is nonsense, or you say why it is vague, right? C subpoint reasons prefer. First is ground. Like there's no delineation of ground for the gov and neg when the alternative is literally everything. The second part is they can shift out of everything, or they can claim that they solve everything. It makes it so they can get out of any position. The next one you're going to say is something like the MG speech is key to debate. It's the hardest one in debate. It's the last time to have stable offense on the government team. You have voters. Fairness, education, a priori, that type of nonsense. You can also run stuff, like if it's a rejection critique, you can say why rejection critiques are bad. Rejection is bad. The first is because it's nihilistic. My favorite answer is the critique justifies intellectual masturbation while people are dying. Rejecting the plan makes us complacent spectators to the violence of the PMC, which makes us helpless to stop the apocalypse. This means... Yeah, no problem. The critique justifies intellectual masturbation. It's fun to say too in a debate round, by the way, you should try it. While people are dying. Rejecting the plan makes us complacent spectators to the horrible shit in the PMC. So like whatever is in the PMC that's bad, we just get to watch. Which makes us helpless to stop the apocalypse. The next is that rejection does nothing. Simple rejection without political engagement doesn't solve decay. It also supercharges perm solvency. Yes?
We stop right there. Well, okay, because I don't know what supercharges.
Supercharge, think about it, man. Do you like cars?
Sure.
Have you ever heard of a supercharger on a car? What does that do?
I don't know. It supercharges it.
Help him. Tell him. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just playing. Supercharge means that it just like rapidly moves in that direction. So you have like a charge like this, and a supercharge is like, right? Like really fast.
Can you repeat the rejection stuff? Rejection does nothing because...
Yeah, rejection does nothing without political engagement, right? That supercharges the perm because that means that the only way to solve for the critique is to have an actual policy to solve for the critique. Right? So that gives you the perm. We have the perm. Marxism is good, but the best way to dismantle Marxism is doing the plan, which means now we have a complete way to solve for the critique, which is only the perm. That's what we're mean by that. Okay. You also want to say stuff like a solvency deficit. So a solvency deficit's the alternative would be something like transition wars. And I'd be like, Judge, can you imagine if tomorrow all of a sudden Capitol Hill is like, yeah, screw this, we're going to Marxism. Like, we don't care. We're going to socialism, or we're going to communism. Can you imagine the transition wars? Like, this isn't just like all of a sudden everyone's like, yeah, it's good. Where do we turn our wallets? Like, where do we turn our change? Like, how do we get rid of our businesses? How do we put all the money back into the state? I mean, how do we level our houses and make all equal houses? Or is it a gigantic grab for power? Like, what happens in that transition?
So
Yes.
you would.
Well, just another way to talk about transition wars is if it's a cap K, that's another term, is that capitalism, first of all, like securitizes the military or funds the military so that transition wars don't happen. It also probably makes sure that like weapons don't get in the hands of these people that are on their grab for power, you know, loose nukes and stuff like that. So that's another impact turn, is the transition wars. That so the perm would shield that link to transition wars.
You also want to talk about how if there's no text to the alternative, like if they say like we need to be questioning or dismantling or interrogating,
Rethink thinking.
Yeah, or rethink thinking. These are vague semantic terms, which means there's no way to clearly articulate what the alternative is or what it does. And this is bad for a couple reasons. The first, this makes them a moving target. They can just change the specifics of their alternative all the time and shift. This also justifies floating picks. They can claim full access to any planned offense and shut off any of the consequences of the actual criticism. A floating pick is a plan-inclusive critique. So there's stuff like do the plan in a feminist lens, right? That's a pick, yeah. Which is very tough to beat because you're now arguing against yourself and you have no idea what this lens is or how it does or what it works or how you do it. It's also, you can say they're cheater perms. That's another way to say them. And at the bottom of this, you want to say, you know, vote affirmative. Like, you just vote AF because if you have an alt that does nothing, you're always going to err affirmative because the MG is the most important speech, and the vagueness of the alternative means that we cannot generate stable offense. Okay? And that's how you go through it. Now, what if the team runs a critical affirmative? They're cheaters. Don't believe Megan Gaffney. She's a cheater. No, I'm just kidding. You're not a cheater, but we're going to say they're cheaters if they run it. Now, there's a couple things you can do. I had a question earlier, like, what if they run a plan and a critical affirmative? The thing you have to listen for is a couple things. How do they get to their impacts, right? How do they get to the impacts? Like, what are their link stories? Do any of them, do they use fiat? Okay. Most of the times it's not using fiat. They'll say stuff like, my partner and I advocate for the plan text. Okay. Or they'll say like, we passed the plan, and then in their advantage they'll say stuff like on the link level, like our discourse shapes the realities, or our discourse changes the ways in which we view the world, which then leads to these impacts. Okay. That's what you want to listen for. Now, if they do not use fiat, that's when you run a fiat abuse position. So you run something like, the affirmative must affirm the topic instrumentally, which means that they must actually use fiat, right, or implement a plan. The 1AC must include a topical plan that is justified with a normative defense of the federal government and the adoption of a policy. You want to talk about how the USFG is the agent of the resolution, not the individual debater. Like, you know, Mariah is not the USFG. I know someday she might want to go into politics, but today is not that day.
Can you reread the interpretation? You must run a plan, but...
Yeah, the affirmative must affirm the topic instrumentally. The 1AC must include a topical plan that is justified with a normative defense of the federal government in the adoption of such a policy. Obviously, if the topic is the UN, we would say the UN, not the USFG, or else that would probably be bad for us, right? So make sure to switch the actor if it's a different actor. Very, very important. Next thing you want to talk about is the violation. So the violation will be something like, they're not the federal government, they do not use fiat, they don't instrumentally adopt a plan.
What would be an example of not instrumentally adopted? That would be separate from not using fiat.
So, like, Oregon says stuff like, Megan Gaffney and I advocate for the labeling of genetically modified foods, right? They're not using fiat, and they will run advantages based off of their personal advocacies.
But how is, like, because you talk about instrumentally affirming something as being separate from not using fiat, so what's the difference? Just the enforcement?
It's pretty much, it's like this, I mean, it's not that different.
Okay.
It's very similar. Yeah.
How would you answer more if they kind of preempt that with like, look, debate's a game of political agency, like we're supposed to picture the world, like this is an entire game of picturing the world in a different way, so us just doing the act of being able to picture it in a different way is better.
That's great. That's awesome. That's where you say stuff like, no, debate's a game, homie. Like, we play this game, and there are rules to this game, and the rules of the game are more important than the education you're talking about, right? So you want to say stuff on game theory, like the first is ground, right? Like, yeah, those arguments are good, but it's more important to uphold ground for both sides to have a debate. We think that this education comes to the clash of ideas, and when you run stuff like that, you rob us of the ability to have stable ground or predictable ground in order to have clash, which destroys education. The second part is you say switch side debate. There's a reason why you switch from government to affirmative, government to opposition back and forth, right? You switch back and forth, and you can run those arguments on the other side. Also, you talk about switch side debate in the manner in which sometimes it is good to argue as if you are evil. Sometimes it is good to argue about stuff you do not believe in. That's why sometimes it's good for you to run conservative arguments. It's good to run liberal arguments if you're conservative, because you get to learn about the other side. And that does two things. First, it either strengthens your own foundation and personal beliefs that you have, or second, it also allows for you to look at the other side and interrogate those things, right, and to find different truths. Okay? So switch side debate is important. The next one's topical education.
Like a standard
Yeah, these are pretty much standards. Topical education's good because we get to talk about the important discussion that is questioned by the resolution. Like, why even have resolutions, right? You want to talk about how the resolution gets us to talk about a plethora of information. It's how we get our breadth of information. The next one I really like that I think is very underutilized is extra topical, and I don't know why people don't just like, I guess it's hard to conceptualize, but extra topicality is awesome. Like, if the resolutions of the United States government, they're probably not topical if it's, you know, me and Shiloh, or, you know, me and Lydia. We're most definitely not the United States federal government. I don't know if you guys know this, but I'm not a part of the government. Okay, so I mean, topicality is a really good thing. A lot of critical asks that do not use the actual resolution, you should always run T. Just always. Whether, I mean, you'll probably not win on it super often, but it is definitely something that gets you those time trade-offs, right? Like, you want to have time trade-offs.
So if there's a topical, or if there's a critical affirmative and you like are running all these types of responses to it, would you still run like the straight up KC prepped, or would you just throw that out and go straight on like theory?
You mean
Turns to
APK?
the K or something like that? Yeah. If there's an APK in your neg, would you still run like straight up DAs that you prepped, or would you go straight for like terms?
It depends if you can. It depends if you can link the disads to their advocacy or to their rhetoric, right, or to their discourse. So she asked if you can still run the stuff you prepped before. Most of the times, probably not. The best things that you want to do here is we talked about before, like what are things that you should have memorized on the opposition? You should have what?
Like theory, T.
Theory.
Defense.
What else? What should just be memorized?
Impact on which side. Counterpoint.
I mean, like strategy. A counterplan. Find a counterplan that can solve. What else? Critiques. You should all have critiques. I would say at least one. You probably want to have 3 critiques just straight up memorized in some form. And you can critique them, right? If they're talking about, you know, a personal advocacy, you can talk about why their methodology is bad or why their ideology is bad, right? If they're running an ideological K, you can say why their methodology is bad, right? Like, you can sit there and you can look at these distinctions. Yeah.
It gets so messy though.
Like, if they're running a critical cap K on the app,
Yes.
Is it advice? Because like my partner and I did this in high school all the time. We'd run the cap K against them and say like state action can't solve in A form. Couple that with T or something like that.
I just feel that that's just like a kind of in college policy a waste of time, because why not just link turn or impact turn it?
Okay.
It's the same answers, right? Like, they say cap bad, and you're gonna run a critique that says cap good. Is that what you're saying?
No.
No.
Like, if they run cap bad on the app, run cap bad on the neg, but couple that with state action can't solve, and like just run a bunch of stuff about.
I just run a statism critique.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
Like, critique the state, critique biopower, you know. And yes, you're right. It does get kind of tough, and it can get messy, but it's getting more and more popular, and it's sort of like I've heard the best people saying just out left them, right? They're gonna go left, go further left. The next thing you want to do is you want to have some role play.
How do you out-left Marxism?
I mean, obviously there's times where you might want to then go right, or...
Oh, no, I was just asking that because I know you asked Megan that today, and I thought she gave a pretty good answer. So.
She says everything links to it, so it's not just out-lefting them, it's just that Marxism links to everything, and everything links to Marxism. So you can run, like, feminism, like Marxism uniquely excludes, like, the feminist, like, voice. You can even talk about, like, you know, you can talk about, like, the radical black aesthetic, where it talks about, or, like, whiteness, how most of the times people who can join, like, Marxist movements are those of, like, class or privilege, and this excludes massive amounts of, like, minorities from being able to do things of this nature. I mean, there are, like, many different critiques you can run. Another standard you can do is bad policy making. Like, you want to have the affirmative subverts discussion of the merits of specific policies, which destroys our ability to compare the effects of plan to the status quo. If it's just like a critical affirmative with no plain text or whatever, you want to talk about how you want to have turn that role playing is good. Concordia ran a critical affirmative, and they kind of said stuff like, the resolution is abusive and it makes us look at like really crappy things and be bad policymakers. So like we need to have more room in debate to talk about critical issues. So we should just like get rid of the resolution, and we need to talk about racism in debate or racism as a whole. And that's when you want to say stuff like no dog, like we shouldn't just have a forum on racism. We need to talk about like policy making, and we need to say like policy making is good. And that's where we use the same answers as you would like to answers critique that we went over earlier, right? So you want to talk about how it's good for personal agency, it's good to create change like our yes men examples, and also how like the Millennium Challenge, how we use role playing to save lives kind of like in the future. And then you want to have voters, right? So you want to have voters to that. So you want to have voters like of fairness, right? Like fairness is a prior question, and that's kind of where you distinguish like in what order things should be viewed, right? Because if not, if you think about it, if they have some sort of critical position, it's usually a critical affirmative. For the most part, it's not using fiat, so you're looking at pre-fiated implications. You want to talk about how we need to evaluate if a critical affirmative, the idea of it is okay, before we start evaluating the impacts of it, right? And that allows you to kind of leverage like your discussion first, right? Sort of like a priori, yeah.
So earlier Brandon was saying that it would be helpful to like have an actual definition of fairness. Would you say that's, do you agree? And like what type of definitions do you think are helpful?
I mean, maybe not just definitions, but you want to have like set guidelines. Like that's how Steve Woods explained it. Like, what do you think like from fairness? I think guidelines are kind of better ways to go than a definition.
Yeah, I think you can definition of like what fair would be. So for instance, an argument that's predicated in the literature base, and you can find by reading the literature would be a fair argument to have to respond to because you should have been reading that. An argument that's really, really weird, maybe not as fair. So it depends on the context of the
So you're saying like competitive equity, like fairness would equal something that provides competitive equity versus like something that provides social equity would be something that like could
Yes. So like in this one, you want to say like fairness is important because of like prep time skew, or that the LOC is the most important for a ground in the speech. They take away this ground, or if they're basically taking your ground. So if it's something that's supposed to stop from something bad, and they're like, no, dog, like we're running this critique and our impact, stop all these bad things. You're like, no, man, like that's our ground. Like we're supposed to be able to, like in fairness, we're supposed to be able to have this negation of the resolution. You can't just say like F the resolution. We're going to talk about these things that are bad. Also talk about education, right? So we're going to talk about like topic-specific education. And why that's good. We also talk about stuff as well, like another thing that is good for comparing is you can say how you can still, like you want to talk about competition between interpretations, right? So one of the things you can do that is you want to say how you can still be topical and you can still use fiat, or you can still implement a plan and have like critical impacts, or you can have, a critical advantage and one normal advantage, or you can run things like, and that allows us to be able to leverage things like disads, counter plans, things of that nature, which then makes it a more fair debate, right? But I think Megan had a good answer to that, but a really good one. What was it again?
Sorry.
One basically I say why just run a critical advantage, right? You don't have to run a whole critical affirmative.
What's the reason why that's good or bad?
It's good because if you just run a critical advantage, then it's better because we have more stable links, and it allows for better delineated ground in debate, because we can run disadvantages, counterplans. You can run fiat, so you can run impacts to what it would look like if implemented, and you can also run critical impacts about how like what is said is also can be good. What was an answer to that you gave?
Answer to that?
Yeah, you gave a good one.
You only get one accurate. Is there
Like if you run like a straight up critical app without using fiat.
What's the answer?
And I think you said something like,
Sorry.
by running a critical advantage and using fiat, it's still bad because you're still upholding like the bad portions or the parts that link to the, like the representation is still bad or something like that when you use fiat, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you can still, so there's answers to both sides, and you just want to be able to leverage both of them. Is there any questions? I know this has been kind of like a super huge lecture with a lot of procedurals. Is there anything that was like not super clear?
It was just really going to be exposed to all of this.
Yeah.
I went over my head, but
Yeah. Well, one of the things that helps you is you want to start like you want to start figuring out which pieces of paper work for you, right? So what's important in a critique when you answer it? The first thing is a framework. Like you've got to answer framework, right? The second thing you want to look for is you want to look for those tricky words, right? Root cause arguments, inevitability arguments. If those claims are in a critique and you do not answer them, you might as well just walk out the door because there is like nothing after that that you can say because you have no more uniqueness in around. You have nothing in there that can help you. Make sure you answer those, right? On the alternative, perms. You want theory. You want solvency deficits, right? And you want some net benefits. Big problem that we had last year at the very beginning is we had permit, but we'd have no benefit, no net benefit. And good debaters would just be like, cool, like, so at best, you probably are as good as us. At worst, you still, the only place that's bad now is you probably still link to the dissad more than us, right? So you will always lose. So you need a net benefit to your perm, okay? And then always walk up with a good order. No more like,
So what was the order you were saying it should go in?
I like going framework, alternative, and then links and impacts in those two orders because you got to answer framework, you got to answer the perms. You'd like to get the other two, but if you don't, at least you still have a fighting chance if you get to framework and the alternative. Cool? All right, I think we're out of time. Thanks, everyone.